Good evening and welcome to the Teagasc Virtual Crop Walk. My name is Michael Hennessy and I'm your host for the evening. Myself and my colleagues are going to come to you from all the way across the country, from Cork, Wexford and Meath, and we're going to be talking about spring crops. Really looking forward to answering your questions over the next hour about all the agronomic and management strategies that are needed over the next couple of weeks. Good evening, and you're very welcome on this lovely, sunny, warm evening. I'm delighted you could join us, and we're here from Oak Park live with you for the next hour. I'm joined here in studio by Stephen Kildea, Shay, Phelan, and Jimmy Staples. So over the next hour, we're going to go all the way across the country. We're going to start in Cork. We're going to have feeds from Wexford and from the Dublin-Meath border. We're going to be looking at crops in each of the various different areas. We're going to have a look at spring barley first of all, and then we're going to go through spring wheat, spring oats, beans, and finally we're going to finish off with tillage grass weeds. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to go straight across to Conor O'Callaghan up in the Dublin-Meath border.
Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to the Northeast region here. We're on the Dublin-Meath border here this evening. And like the rest of the country, we're trying to deal with the drought situation that we're having at the moment. Going from the wettest February on record to now having a soil moisture deficit of 65 millimetres. And this in turn has led to the early sown spring barley crops establishing well, like this one here. It was sown in early April. We've establishment rates of up on 95%. Crop is looking well, has tillered well. On the other hand, we have, as the later sown crops and soil moisture levels reduced, we have poor establishment rates, as low as 50% in some fields in this area. We're here this evening debating whether to go with a T1 fungicide on this crop of spring barley. Disease levels are very low. Ramillaria is there maybe in some places, but with Rhynchosporium and net blotchy levels are very low due to the low rainfall. This crop here has received a trace element at growth stage 14 to 15 early on, and we can still see visible signs of trace element deficiencies. So we're wondering, would we go with a fungicide and trace element again?
Spring barley in Wexford and Wicklow are at second node to awns emerging, depending on drilling date. Crops are variable, with better crops having well consolidated seed beds where moisture has been well retained. For the month of April and May to date, there has been 42 millimetres of rainfall over 3 rainfall events in Johnstown Castle. With significant soil moisture deficits, crops have found it harder to access P and K this season. The benefits of well-consolidated seed beds and placed P and K is particularly evident on low P and K index sites. Crops are particularly clean, and all crops at this stage have received their T1 with a proline-based product. Considering that a proline-based product was used in the T1 predominantly, what should be used in the T2 and when should it be applied?
Crops in Cork are looking very well at the moment. We've had some great weather over the past 2 months that has given crops a great boost in growth. Winter crops have really caught up on themselves from the start of the year, and spring crops are looking very, very well. The weather dried up with us around Patrick's Day, giving us a great window to plant spring crops kind of from late March and early April. We're after about 140 mils of rain since the beginning of April, roughly 70 mils in April and another further 70 to date so far in May. And that rainfall has fallen very strategically to really aid growth here in Cork. But with the ideal growing conditions that we're seeing, we're also seeing a fairly high level of disease pressure. We don't need to go too far to find Rhynchosporium or to find net blotch. This is a crop of planet spring barley sown in late March. It's a very advanced crop of planet. It's just at about growth stage 37 there now with the flag leaf peeping. Probably a bit more advanced than most spring barley we're seeing in Cork. Most spring barley is around growth stage 32. This crop has received its first fungicide. It'll be needing a second fungicide at the awns, but a concern of a lot of farmers in Cork at the moment is, are crops going to stand? They are very thick. So should we be looking at a possible growth regulator strategy in this crop going forward?
Okay, there's a lot to get our teeth into there. There's a lot of questions there. And just to remind everyone that there's a Q&A. It's a little button kind of on the bottom of your screen down there. Click onto that and you can type in a question at any stage and we'll try our best to answer it as we're going. So maybe Stephen, just to turn back to you, there's a few questions there and I might start with you. First question came from the northeast there and it was about the first fungicide on spring barley. What sort of program should it go with, or should they go with a program at all?
Okay, thanks, Michael. And I think Conor presents two different types of crops up there in the northeast. And I might ask Shay maybe to comment on the second crop, and I'll comment on the first. So if the first, he describes it having very good establishment. It looks like a very good crop. It's quite clean of disease. It's now into stem extension. And I suppose the question is at the moment, look, does it need a fungicide at this stage? Can we wait? Can we sort of stretch that into the next, or combine, I suppose, the two fungicide applications potentially? I think that question comes back down to what is the risk and understanding the risk of the problems that might be there. And that comes back to, okay, the crop is well into stem extension. It's probably going to multiply or go through that very, very quickly over the next few days, given the temperatures that we have. So I'd be thinking that if there's very, very low disease there, and diseases we're talking about net blotch and rhinchosporium, it may be a case that actually that can be stretched into that sort of final, what we would call the final fungicide application, maybe at sort of a flag leaf fully emerged into early booting, and to target the disease control at that stage. We're looking then something that would be controlling ramularia from the very start. But again, the risk even at ramularia at this stage may also be low, because although there's a lot of stress under those crops, it does also need quite a bit of moisture to get going. That said, look, it will come in if we do get a bit of rain over the next month or so. So some level of protection will be required there. I'm thinking, first of all, a multi-site should be going in there. And at this stage now, we're after the 20th of May, that's Fulpit. And also potentially proline or a thio-based type product should also be going into that. That sort of scenario, I think you'd be looking at, I suppose, what sort of pressure it may be coming at over the next week or so.
So crops are under a bit of stress. They're looking reasonably good up there. No disease pressure. You can probably get maybe away with one fungicide application, but wait till your flag leaf kind of onset.
I think so. I suppose we look at the disease control from a spring barley perspective. The early application is protect those tillers, make sure you've got those through. I suppose that job has been done by the lack of rain that is up there. In fact, probably now that what will be killing those tillers may even be drought. So the next step is actually then to protect those leaves to go forward.
So Shay, then going across to you maybe on the other crop we've seen, which didn't look great from where I was standing anyway. What should a guy do with some of those crops like that?
Yeah, and it's a good point, Michael. I mean, Conor mentioned there in the clip there that the emergence in some of those crops is quite poor. So you're looking at maybe, he was mentioning a figure there about 50% emergence. So if you take that and look at the yield potential that you're going to have in that crop going forward, you're probably looking at maybe, a ton and a half to the acres, that type of magnitude. So really in that case, I mean, there's a point that is going to probably come in the future where you're just probably going to have to cut your losses on those crops, look and see what's there, and then make a decision whether to keep putting something on them or not. One of the things that's evident in those crops there is there seems to be quite a bit of P and K deficiency and nitrogen deficiency, which again is coming from what Stephen says is coming from the drought. So really and truly, I think they're going to really have to cut back on those and might want to spend on those.
You can buy water. Water is what's needed, basically. That's what you need to go on to it. The second question, maybe is for the slightly better crops, Shay, is the trace elements. Yeah. Should a guy throw in trace elements? Maybe if he's only going to one final spray at the end, should he put them in?
Yeah, and again, it's a good question. And from the point of view of trying to keep that crop green and keep that crop going, first of all, guys should be looking at their soil test and seeing is there an inherent deficiency there, whether it be manganese or magnesium or zinc or copper, whatever it is, and certainly treat those first. But what we tend to see at the moment in the crops there in the northeast and some of the crops around the country are these drought-induced deficiencies. So really and truly, putting out growth rate or putting out trace elements on those will only have a very limited effect unless we get rain. And talking to my colleagues Mark Plunkett and Richie Hackett around the country, they're kind of saying really and truly, if you knew there was rain coming, yes, by all means put them on them. But if there's no rain coming, it's a gamble at this stage.
Okay, so moving down the country a little bit, some of the other questions that were there. If we move down, we think about, I suppose, maybe more normal crops as we see now in Wexford, and obviously maybe higher disease, maybe down in Cork. So final fungicide, what should we go with? And there was a question here from Andy Doyle asking the question, is it growth stage 39 or is it 45? You might just maybe have a go at that briefly.
Okay, so I suppose the first question would be, like that Andy is asking about the growth stage. I suppose it's really, I suppose 39 to 49, really being honest. And it's if we think about it from the paintbrush submerged aspect, but if we were to go at one application, it potentially would be at that 39. In terms of what should be going into it and things like that, we have to look again at the risks that are going to be coming into the crop, potentially would be coming in to make a decision on what sort of products or chemicals we would be using. Take it that, okay, ramularia, get a bit of rain over the next, I suppose, 3 weeks, the crop's under stress, we may well see ramularia, so we put I suppose the first components would be going in that multi-site to form a full bit, proline or pathio based, as I say. And then as you move down to the cork sort of scenario, Michael was sort of talking about, there is active Rinco about, there's active net blotch. Then we need to be sort of adding another aspect or another chemical into that, so whether it's a strub or an SDHI. I suppose for those type of cork crops, the cork crops, they've got very good potential there, so nothing really necessarily changes. They had moisture, they have that disease pressure.
Just to stick with the cork crop, we're under a bit of time pressure now, but just stick with the cork crop, Shay. I suppose lots of people in the Northeast would be jealous looking at them. Their question was about how do we keep them standing, or do we need a PGRE at this stage?
Yeah, I suppose we're in a fortunate position from that point of view, Michael. Looking at the crop that's there in front of Michael, or that Michael was in, they are very lush crops. And I suppose if we go backwards before we talk about PGRs, in a lot of cases, I suppose, look at the varieties that are there. So the likes of Planet is not great from a straw standing point of view. So nitrogen is your first port of call in terms of keeping crops standing. And I think that's something we kind of have to have as a fundamental when we're trying to keep barley standing. The work that's been done here at the moment in Oak Park on PGRs on spring barley, we haven't a whole lot of results back from it yet, but I mean, the information in terms of PGRs on spring barley wouldn't be brilliant. So at this stage, really, if you're in a situation where the crops are in danger of falling, you really only have two options. You're looking at something like Medix Max or Turple at this stage. They're the only two products that are approved up to where Michael's crop is in Cork at 37. All the other products are not recommended. So really it's down to those two choices, but it's far from ideal to have a crop in that situation in the first place. Nitrogen is where they should have started back.
I think it'd probably be reasonable maybe to say that if your crop is under stress, or it happens to be in Cork or the outskirts of Cork,
the last thing you should put on is a PGR. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So look, we're going to move on a little bit now, and we're going to maybe go down to John Pettit down in Wexford, who is going to talk a little bit about spring wheat, and joined by colleagues then from Cork and up as far as Meath.
The area of spring wheat drilled in Wicklow and Wexford has increased significantly. The predominant varieties drilled include Chillum, Mistral and Hiranda. Crops are variable with lime, phosphorus, potassium and trace element issues evident in some crops, particularly those following layers. Crops are at second node to flag leaf fully emerged, depending on drilling date. Crops have received a T1 and PGR to date and are extremely clean. Considering that we've had very low levels of disease pressure to date and have dry weather predicted over the coming week, is there scope for savings on fungicide expenditure in a T2?
Chillum spring wheat, again, planted in the last days of March. Very, very nice, thick, even crop. A bit of scorching, probably from the growth regulator, gone out in maybe a bit harsher conditions in the last 10 days. The crop is currently at growth stage 32. It's got a mildewcide, it's got its growth regulator, and I suppose from now, we're looking at what will we use as a main fungicide on the flag leaf. We estimate the flag leaf to go maybe 10 days from emergence.
Hi, we're back here now again in a field of spring wheat. It was sown in mid-March. The variety is Chillum. It has established well. It has started tillered well. Currently, the growth stage is at 37. Just coming up on 37, we can see our flag leaf coming here. Disease pressure is quite low. There's rust in places on some varieties and bits of mildew we have to watch out for. This crop here has received no fungicide so far, and it is due for its top dress of nitrogen. So two concerns we have with this is what would be the best form of nitrogen to go with in a drought situation? Is it protected urea or liquid nitrogen? And also, can we cut costs on fungicide spend this year, being so dry?
Okay, certainly we've got a better range of crops up there, lads. So I was going to go straight into the question. Stephen, the question asked there about fungicides. What's the best fungicide strategy, given, I suppose, a lot of the crops, or maybe whether you're in Cork or up in the northeast, they're pretty clean looking at the moment?
Yeah, look, we've had a wonderful couple of weeks in terms of dry weather that will have reduced what we would normally regard as our wet weather diseases. But that said, look, there's still going to be concerns over some of our drier weather diseases, your yellow rust and your mildew. I know the weather, I suppose, in the last couple of weeks would have been very cold. That will have knocked them back considerably also. But it would be they would be the diseases, I suppose, I'd be most concerned about at this stage, the mildew and the yellow rust. I suppose the septoria would always be one that would be in the back of the mind, but the weather really has taken care of that quite a lot in the last couple of weeks. So with those two diseases in mind, you'd be tailoring, I suppose, the fungicide program to really try and capture those.
Okay. Question, Shay, for yourself, that was posed in the northeast as regards going to the next round of nitrogen. What form of nitrogen should that be? Is it CAN? Is it protected urea? Is it some of the liquids, I suppose, that people are using at the moment?
Yeah, again, a good question, I suppose, and it's rain dependent, I suppose, Michael. I mean, going with fertilizers now on the soils up there, and as you can see in the northeast, are very bare, they're very dry. So even going with a compound, whether it be CAN or like protected ureas, which are better than normal ureas because they're obviously protected from volatilization, they won't really react until they get moisture in the soil, until they get rain on top of them to wash them into the soil. So whether you pick either or, they're probably both relatively safe products. CAN probably has better spreadability for any of those guys on wider tram lines, so you would say that probably has an advantage from that point of view in terms of, or over the protected urea. In terms of the liquid nitrogens, you're probably talking something like a UAN product, and in those cases there, they can be more volatile, so you have to be careful with those. They're 50% of those products, as far as I'm aware, are urea based, so you can lose some of that. The two other points about liquid forms of nitrogen is there's a higher potential for scorch if you're spraying them on very warm, dry, sunny days like what we're having at the moment. And also you have to be set up for them. You can't just go out and put them through your sprayer. You have to have the proper nozzles, etc., just to get them on, because you're trying to drip them down into to the base of the crop. So is there a question mark even that guys should be asking themselves about the potential of the crop and the total nitrogen maybe should be putting on? Again, yes, a very good point. I mean, they should be looking at those crops and seeing where they potentially can get to. You know, even at this stage, you're looking at, there's no rain forecast that we can see for another 7 to 10 days. So even putting those fertilizers out now, you're not going to get a kick on them until sometime in the middle of June. And what sort of a crop is going to be left there at that stage, I don't know. Okay. And in a similar vein, there was another question posed by the lads, probably, I suppose, in the year that's in it. It's a recurring question you're probably going to see this evening is, you know, you talked about fungicides, and, you know, we're probably not talking about the normal standard fungicide application. The question is, how low can we go, or what risk should guys be able to put up with?
Yeah, so I think there's actually probably two ways of looking at this. It's always the aspect of the dose, but also the aspect about the products. And I think if I get back to that first sort of the question in terms of what diseases maybe, I say we're mostly going to be targeting something like yellow rust and mildew. And a lot of these crops are quite clean. So what we're looking at now is a lot of protection going forward. Crops may be a little bit further advanced. We might hope for a long grain filling period that will require protection. We're hoping that there's going to be some rain in the next couple of weeks to drive on crops and drive on yield. That will drive on disease. So it is a matter of actually choosing the right product, but there is scope, I think, for also choosing a rate and being reflective of the risk and I suppose the pressure that will be there. Look, the case would be all crops are not going to be perfectly clean. There may be something knocking around the base, but that doesn't mean that full rates are going to be required. I think it is going to be a case of getting into crops, seeing what the risk is there and matching it accordingly. But I do think there is scope for that reduced rates than would, I suppose, typically normally be used. Again, we're looking for a lot of protection.
I suppose also taking it into account for spring wheat, there's a long ways to go yet in comparison to maybe spring barley.
Yeah, and I think if we would like to see quite a bit of a grain filling period, hopefully, and that will require, I suppose, protection. We're protecting those upper leaves, to try and fill those grains as much as possible.
Okay. Right, so we're going to move on again because we're going to go through the crops fairly rapidly. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch now to oats, and we're going to go down to Michael McCarthy down in Cork.
We're here in Cork in a crop of Isabel spring oats, sown on the last days of March. The crop is very, very clean and it's very, very uniform. Okay, so much like an awful lot of spring crops in Cork at the moment. So at the moment, this crop is at growth stage 32. It's received its first growth regulator and it has received its first fungicide. So from now on, we're looking at what does this crop need in terms of growth regulation going forward, and also in terms of fungicide strategy going forward.
Back here again now on a crop of spring oats. The variety is Isabel, who was sown in mid-March. It established well, has tillered well, and disease pressure is quite low. We've low levels of rust, but there is mildew creeping into it in certain places. The crop currently is at growth stage 31/32, so it's an ideal timing for our growth regulator on spring oats.
Crops of spring oats are at second node to flag leaf emerging, depending on drilling date. Crops of spring oats have withstood low soil moisture deficits extremely well in comparable to spring barley. Low soil moisture deficits have eliminated lush growth, resulting in shorter internode spacings with stiffer stems. Crops are clean of disease, and all but a few crops have very high yield potential. Considering that crown rust is our biggest threat in the southeast, what are the T2 products of choice, and when should the T2 be applied?
Okay, again, a number of questions there from the lads around the country. I'm going to throw the first one to you, Shay. Most people, I suppose, have their main tray cell or PGR on at growth stage 32, maybe with the exception of the northeast. You might maybe mention something small about that, but maybe down in Cork, then they're more worried about maybe crops falling over at a later stage.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Again, there's a huge difference between the crops. The crops up in the northeast are kind of at that 31, 32 timing, which we know from Oak Park, our trials here in Oak Park over the last number of years is the ideal timing. That 32 timing gives you the most shortening effect. So if you want a single application, that's where you need to go. So for those crops up there, I'd be trying to time my application. And again, with the concern about stress crops and all that goes with it when you're putting on a PGR. So ideally, you'd like to have a bit of kindness on those before you put the PGR on, but needs must in certain cases. If you have to delay it, or you have to go with another PGR down in Cork or in Wexford, where the crops are maybe more prone to lodging because they're that bit heavier, you're going to have to look at your product choice. I mean, your product choice, once you get into flag leaf emergence, becomes quite narrow. So you're looking at the likes of Modus or Medix Max or something like that, and maybe the likes of K2 products, which are recommended up to flag leaf emergence. So your suite of choice, or your choice of products, narrows down quite considerably once you get to your flag leaf stage, and you don't tend to get the same level of shortening as you do at the earlier application.
And I suppose it's probably worth saying, is it as well, or your comment maybe on the variety just there, because there may be differences.
Yeah, exactly. Again,
and obviously the overall nitrogen crops can often look much better this time of the year than maybe another couple of weeks.
Yeah, so there's no doubt about it. I mean, if you're looking at like the Barrow, which is quite poor in terms of standing power, obviously you're going to look at that. Again, if the nitrogen has gone out and now at this stage, there's not a whole lot you can't take it off, but there's not a whole lot you can do about that. So you're going to have to match your strategy to kind of take care of both the variety and how much nitrogen has been put on it up to now.
Okay. Stephen, next question across to you. It's a fungicide one, obviously, again. And so the question really is with regards to final fungicide. Maybe in the northeast, I haven't quite got that far, but the rest of the country, a lot of it is kind of in another week or 10 days or so, the final fungicide. What should people be thinking about? And given the fact that crops are, some of them relatively good, relatively low disease, where should they be at?
Okay, I suppose the one thing to note from the guys is that there's some good potential there in those spring crops by the looks of it. Okay, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of disease, but I suppose Shay touched on one aspect, and that was variety. And I think this is very important to note, in that we know that most of the varieties that are out there, like if you take Bar for example, will be very susceptible to crown rust and also to mildew. Husky also will be quite susceptible to both of those diseases. Then some of the other varieties will have strengths and weaknesses. So what I would be saying is there's quite a bit of potential there, and the diseases that we're talking about, the rust and the mildew, can come in quite rapidly. And again, it's about prolonging that grain filling, making sure we fill those grains that are coming in. So we'll be thinking about a fungicide strategy going on for the final one. Again, it's going to target those diseases. Those are the main two diseases. So we're going to be looking at something that is very good on rust, but also very good on mildew. And we can sort of pick and choose a number of different things. I'd be thinking something like Latticearia that would have, I suppose, it has proline or pathio based in it, I should say, and a good SDHI to cover the rust, to cover the mildew. But there's other options also there. So I know for the rust aspect, you might be looking at the tebuconazole based and maybe a strobilurin based also. But it is a case of, just because they may look perfectly clean at the moment, those diseases can come in quite rapidly and could cause a bit of damage. I know winter crops at the moment don't have a huge amount of disease, whether that's a barometer for the amount that might carry over to spring. I think again it's going to be dictated by the amount of rain that will arrive when that arrives is the question.
Has that changed now in comparison to Cork and Wexford, maybe down southern Wexford, in terms of the disease profile, in comparison to maybe guys who are under water stress up around the northeast? Is there a different profile of disease, and should they be looking at cutting back again fungicides because yield potential might be there?
Yeah, so that comes back to that question about potential. Because definitely, okay, down we look at Cork, they have the rainfall that we saw earlier on, big difference in rainfall. The disease spectrum will be pretty much the same and will be dictated to a certain extent by the rain or the moisture that does arrive over the next couple of weeks. But again, coming back to that yield potential, if the yield is not necessarily there, whether the spend is justified on it is questionable. But looking at a lot of those crops there, it did look like there was good yield potential in those ones anyhow.
Okay, there's just a question here from John to you, Shay, and the question is about stress around that critical time around growth stage 32 to flag leaf. How much of an effect is that, do you think, or is there research maybe in there that might point us towards something?
There is, no doubt. I mean, the work that's gone on here over the last number of years shows pretty conclusively that where an oat crop is stressed around the 20 days either side of flowering, that you do tend to get panicle or a grain abortion in the panicle. So it does affect quality also. So I mean, stress can be any form. Certainly they're under stress at the moment. Oats don't like this really hot, dry weather. So that's a stress. A heavy rate of PGR would also be a stress. So there's different types of stresses that can affect oats at this stage. Some we can manage, some we can't. The drought stress we simply just can't manage. And no doubt it probably will have an effect on crops if this drought extends later in towards heading out stage on those spring oat crops.
Okay, so another one just in here from Daniel talking about, again, you're talking about growth regulator on spring oats. I mean, how critical is it that we avoid it? Is it kind of a question that you have to weigh up your yield to your potential risk on that? I'm presuming you're talking about growth stage 32 probably at this stage.
Yeah, again, yeah, it does. And it depends, like you say, on variety as well. So some of the likes of Isabel will stand that a little bit better than, said, likes of Barra. So it's, again, assessing what's in front of you. If you haven't got out at 32 and you're panicking, I'd say don't panic. You still have the other options. So don't worry about it too much. If the crop is under an awful stress at the moment, it's probably not going to get terribly tall anyway. So the same lodging pressure is not likely to be there. Certainly from what seems to be there in the northeast, they don't seem to be getting as tall as they are or as lush as they are down south. So look at if he's missed that timing at 32, I'd say don't panic. Just bide your time. Wait till the crop gets on a bit further, gets out of a bit of stress. See what's in front of you, and use the products that are available.
I think that video showed a little bit of observation like that some of the internodes did seem to be quite shorter as well. So look, what we're going to do is we're going to move on a little bit now, and we can come back to a few questions that are in here afterwards. We're going to move on to talk about spring beans. So we're going to head up to Conor O'Callaghan back in the Dublin Meath region again.
We're here in a field of spring beans now. It was sown mid-March. The variety is Lynx. As you can see from behind me, we have a good plant stand, a good establishment rate of 40 plus plants per metre squared. The crop is struggling a bit from drought situation. It is short, it is quite short. Our flowers are maybe 10 days to 2 weeks away. Our next question we have is, with a fungicide on this crop, there's no chocolate spot around, disease pressure is quite low in this area. Is it justifiable to put a fungicide onto this in the next coming couple of weeks?
This is a crop of lynx spring beans sown in the 3rd week of March, just after the weather dried up. It is a very nice, even, established crop. It's just at the first flower bud stage, okay? Chocolate spot can be found quite easily in this crop as we look through it in the lower leaves. We can also see a level of notching on the leaves from the bean weevil. While some crops in the area were sprayed for bean weevil, we felt this didn't justify a pyrethroid, so it wasn't sprayed. Our main thing now going forward is a fungicide strategy for this crop to protect it from chocolate spot going forward.
The area of spring beans drilled this season in Wicklow and Wexford has increased dramatically. Establishment rates have been exceptional, with plant counts ranging anything from low to high 30s per square metre. Leaf notching was present in many crops, with a high proportion of crops sprayed for bean weevil. Weed control has been variable due to the lack of adequate levels of soil moisture. The majority of crops are now approaching a T1. There are some reports of downy mildew in crops. Considering that the weather has been dry to date and with very little rainfall predicted, can a T1 be delayed, generating the potential for more persistency post T2?
Okay, yet again, some very different crops all the way across the country. I suppose we hope that the weather does change a little bit to kind of keep beans going, because they do like a wetter rather than really dry weather. So just coming back across to you, Stephen, a couple of questions there. Obviously, a lot of them are focused around fungicides. So a couple of questions there, certainly from Cork, maybe it's the higher disease pressure about chocolate spot, and also maybe a little bit about downy mildew.
Yeah, I suppose, look, if we're talking about chocolate spot, it is a disease that does thrive in wet conditions. And I suppose in terms of products that might be used necessarily specifically on chocolate spot, you'd be talking about something, Signum, I suppose, would be the standard that would be used. It contains 2 different, I suppose, actives in there, and you're looking at, I suppose, resistance management and an efficacy point of view. There's other options that we could probably look at other strobs included in it, or an azole, for example. But I think it's the aspect about chocolate spot is going to be about the weather that's going to be conducive to that disease at this time. So if it turns really, really dry, that will not drive the disease. Now, there's other diseases, I suppose, definitely, and I know that was mentioned there, I think down in the southeast is downy mildew, for example. That again can look really, really dramatic. It tends to come in a lot more patchiness in the field, and whether it's a sort of a prophylactic preventive application is required for that would always be questionable. And whether it's actually a case by case basis, and if it's quite bad, whether you try and stop it in terms of curativity. And again, the standard there would be the Ridamil Gold, the phenylamide that is in that. But it's really about how much damage something like that is actually going to do in terms of downy mildew. It can look a lot more dramatic in terms of its damage than actually its impact on yield. That said, if it does get going, it can hit big patches in the field.
But presumably chocolate spot is probably the major one guys should be looking out for.
Yeah, chocolate spot generally would be the major one that people should be looking out for. A couple of very clear lesions in the video there. But once it does get going, it can be quite aggressive. But it does also require a lot of moisture. It does require moisture. And I think at this stage, look, crops are looking for moisture. So look, you'd nearly be happy to actually go and put on an application if the moisture can. If the moisture doesn't come, as you mentioned there at the start, what will that impact be in terms of yield anyhow?
And what about rust?
Rust, yeah.
The way as well?
Rust wasn't, I don't know if rust was mentioned, but rust could be one that would be also damaged. I suppose when we're talking about the products that would be put on, I mentioned Signum, I mentioned the Strob, the components of those would be very good against rust. So you should be covering rust when you're covering chocolate spot.
Okay. So the other question was there, and it might come to you, Shay, for this one, is in Wexford in general, they looked at weed control. It didn't seem wonderful, as was mentioned on it. So in terms of options that growers have at the moment, broadleaf weeds and maybe even some of the grass weeds as well.
Yeah, looking at the crop there that John was showing us in Wexford, and we're starting to flower, so that really limits the options you have. For broadleaf weeds, unfortunately, the game is pretty much up at this stage. You've gone too late on any of the products that are available. They're not going to do anything at this stage. From the grassweed point of view, and I think this is where there are options there, but again, we're running out of time very, very quickly, and it might come to something that Jimmy's going to talk about later on. We'll talk about grass weeds. There are options there in terms of taking out grass weeds that you don't have in other crops, say like the cereals. So it does help from an IPM strategy that if you're taking out, say, the likes of wild oats or grass weeds, whatever they be, whether it be scotch or Italian ryegrass or whatever it is, that you do have options there to control those in beans now that you may not have in other cereal crops. So it does help with an IPM strategy to try and use a different active ingredient to take those grass weeds out now, rather than trying to deal with them in the cereal following this.
And just to follow up to that, in terms of the products that you're going to use, is there a latest timing for some of those?
Yeah, and again, you're going to have to look at labels. I mean, generally talk about early flowering. So again, you're looking at the likes of Fuselade, Max, Falcon, those type of graminicide type products. You're going to have to look at the label and see which one is available to the guys in the area. Not all of them are available everywhere, so you're just going to have to see on the label what's the latest timing for those. Generally, it's around early flowering time for those.
And of course, we have to remember the choice of product and the choice of rate.
Exactly.
Given grass weeds are probably growing.
And again, they're probably going to be strong at this stage if the grass weeds haven't been controlled up to now. So you're going to have to keep your rates up to try and get good control of those weeds, especially like the scotches and scotch grass, and they're going to take quite a bit of killing at this stage.
Okay. Just wanted to ask one more question to yourself, Stephen, and John Pettit in Wexford talked about the fungicide, the first fungicide. Could he delay that first fungicide and either wrap it maybe into the second one maybe, or to push out both fungicides out a little bit further into the season to get better control, better persistence?
I suppose the second aspect about that pushing it out further is only so far you're going to be able to push it out in terms of actually going through the crop of beans, irrespective anyhow. But it gets back to, I suppose, the first question in terms of chocolate spot, in terms of managing the disease. I suppose if we take Oak Park, for example, it would generally be a lot drier than the southeast, and our response always to chocolate spot wouldn't always necessarily be huge. There might be a bigger response down along the coast, where there is quite a bit of moisture. But again, it's going to come back to that. It's going to come back to the risk, and that is going to be driven by the rain. And if there's no rain, it means that actually the disease pressure is going to be quite low. And it will come back to actually what that impact will be on the crop and the impact on yield and aspects like that. And it will have to be weighed up in that sort of a manner.
I suppose in other years you'd always have a scenario whereby you're always struggling to get into actually spray the beans because they're gone too tall.
Exactly, and there's only so far really that you can push anything out.
Perhaps they're not that tall.
The
yield mightn't be in
that is something that if the moisture doesn't arrive, the impact on beans, as we know, will be quite big.
Question, I suppose, come back to you, Shay, here from Colin, and it's to do with insecticides on beans. Do I suppose in the warm conditions we're probably going to get more insects kicking around. Does a guy need to put in an insecticide when he's going with his fungicide?
Generally, no, would be the answer. Quite often, what you often see are the aphids colonize one or two plants at the very top of the plant, maybe 2 or 3 inches at the top of those plants, and there seem to be huge infestations of those individual plants. But rarely do they ever spread to the neighbouring plants. So in that case, I would say most times, no, there's no justification for putting on an insecticide at that time. The other thing that we have to realise as well is at that flowering stage, we have a lot of bees, hopefully, in the crop who are doing a great job for farmers pollinating all those flowers. So putting in an insecticide then is not going to help those. So it could be actually counterproductive in that way to put an insecticide out to target what you think is a pest, but may not be much of a pest.
Okay, so the answer is no.
No.
IPM, integrated pest manager, is a big time in there, and get your beneficials in there doing the job for you. Shay, I'm going to nail you for another one. It might be a bit more tricky, which is one about how sensitive are beans to trace element deficiencies.
The answer is they are quite sensitive in the current climate because moisture is stressing them more so than anything else at the moment. So they are quite sensitive. But again, it's moisture induced, providing that there's no inherent deficit in the soil, it's moisture induced deficiencies that they're looking at the moment. While you can put out trace elements on them now, coming up to flowering, the earlier you can get them out, the better. How they're going to react or how they're going to pay in the long run would be questionable because, again, it's moisture that they're lacking, and beans like moisture, and unfortunately not getting them this year.
Okay, Well, thanks very much, guys. What we're going to do is we're going to switch away from the crops, but certainly for everybody looking in this evening, keep your questions coming. There's a few we haven't answered yet, so keep them coming, and we're going to come back to some of these crops a little bit later on. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back out the country. We're going to Jimmy Staples and Michael McCarthy have a bit of a report on grass weeds in tillage crops.
So today we're in a crop of winter oats where we have identified a blackgrass issue. So a lot of people are asking, how do we identify blackgrass at this time of the year? So what you're looking for is you're looking for sort of a long, slender plant, fine leaves, tend to go up to a point, and you also have a very fine head. Blackgrass at this time of the year will be coming out. It'll either be coming towards the end of flowering, or it'll start to have set seed in the head at this stage. You will also find some purpling of the heads where they have come out of flowering as well. So we did some counts within this field to see what the populations are like, and we've come with a figure of about 1,000 heads per metre squared. So at that level of infestation, you're looking at probably 50% yield reduction in this crop of oats. So the blackgrass in this field was only identified about 2 weeks ago. So given the high number of heads per metre squared, the advice was given that crop destruction was probably his best option. So roughly 5 to 7 days ago, he went in and he sprayed off the 5 acres where he has the highest infestation with Roundup in order to prevent weed seed return. So going forward, the management of the blackgrass population on this farm will be based around a robust integrated pest management strategy, which will be devised around the herbicide resistant profile of the blackgrass. So there'll be a range of cultural options open to the farmer coming up to harvest, during harvest, which will probably centre around good on-farm hygiene, and post-harvest.
So here in Cork, we have grass weed issues like every other region in the country. We have issues with canary grass, sterile brome, wild oats, and to a lesser extent, blackgrass. What's very common this year, what I find from walking crops, is seeing this encroaching brome into fields. And I suppose we need to look at methods going forward for how we control that and keep it in the hedgerows.
Okay, yeah, that's a great roundup. Jimmy, thanks for going out there for us. Jimmy, you talked there about crop destruct. That sounds like a very radical kind of thing to do. Most guys are, they're used to dealing with the likes of wild oats that can be controlled, and they'll put up with them and they'll work through them. But crop destruct, it sounds a bit dramatic, really. Why is blackgrass so different than other grass weeds?
I suppose it does sound a bit drastic, but I suppose blackgrass its phenomenal potential for producing seed is really one of its big advantages, and it very quickly can go from being in a situation where you have a blackgrass population that is very easily controlled through Rogan. In a couple of seasons, you have an infestation like what you've seen in the video, and you're looking at significant yield reductions up to 50% in some cases. So it's really important that you get in on top of it very quick. And that's why I suppose we recommend crop destruct. It also has that ability to spread through your farm quite rapidly. So you need to sort of protect your farm as well. So really you're looking at, in order to stop blackgrass becoming a big problem on the farm, you're looking at getting up to 97% control year on year in order to prevent that. So this is where your integrated pest management and your early identification comes in, putting in that 5-year plan, and getting in and using all those cultural control options that are available to you in order to prevent that from happening, with preventing seed return and stopping it spreading across the farm as being primary objectives.
So for this guy here that we were looking at, he had spring oats. Obviously, he hadn't identified that problem too early in stage, and he identified it this year, as you pointed out. So this year is the first year of crop destruct of a 5-year plan that's going to need to be put in place on the farm. Is that the way he needs to look at it?
That's exactly it. So judging by the level of blackgrass that's on the farm, it's probably been there for maybe 2 to 3 years now at this stage. He went with winter oats, not knowing he had blackgrass. That's why we talk about early identification, integrated pest management, very important. So he's looking at a 5-year plan now, looking at all those cultural options open to him, being rotation, looking at winter and spring cropping, cereal and break crops. Depending on the herbicide resistance profile of the blackgrass, then we'll be able to design a plan around what herbicides you can use and that aren't going to be effective. You're looking at all those other cultural controls, delayed sowing in the autumn if you're going winter cereals, using spring crops that are a little bit more competitive. So there's a range of different things that we need to look at, and it really be based around the individual situation and what the resistance profile of the blackgrass is.
Okay, so obviously you found blackgrass there, and it's not the first place you found it. How common is it around the country?
It's fairly it's quite common out at this stage, I suppose. We've identified it in most of the main arable counties in the country now at this stage, in certain places. Like I'd say we've about 50 reported cases of it, with people that are engaging with Teagasc, whether it's through the farmer themselves or through their advisor or through the merchant. But I feel like there's an awful lot more of it out there. There's a perceived stigma around, I have blackgrass, I don't want to be letting people know I have blackgrass. And this underreporting is potentially causing a bigger problem because, again, it's not been identified early and you're not getting into management on top of that. So it's there's also probably pockets of it. There's certain parts of the country that are probably affected a little bit worse than other parts of the country. The northeast has a large number of cases, as well as maybe South Tip and East Cork. So
but there's nowhere immune, basically, that
nowhere immune.
It
potentially could get anywhere. Yeah.
Can I ask you just then about, we know that there's blackgrass, a huge problem in the UK, and we also know that resistance in that blackgrass herbicide resistance is a big problem as well.
Yeah.
Is that a problem in Ireland, And if a farmer has or maybe suspects herbicide resistance, how does he know?
It is here. I suppose the farmer's not going to know until he starts using herbicides on it and trying to control it, and he'll know pretty quickly whether he has an issue with herbicide resistance or not, because he just won't be getting the control on it. I would always say assume that your blackgrass is resistant because you're not 100% sure where it came from. So assume resistance and get it tested. And once it's tested, and we can test it as part of the ECT project, we're offering a herbicide resistance testing facility up here in Oak Park. So if you assume resistance, send it into us, we can get it tested, and you can go from there. But like I say, until you actually start spraying your herbicides on it, you won't actually know.
So at what stage should farmers be sending in samples into yourselves here?
So we need the seed off a mature plant. So ideally, the blackgrass should be shedding seed in order for the seed to be suitable for testing here, because we had issues of samples being sent in before the seed was ripe in the head, and we had awful issues around trying to get it germinate in order to do the resistance testing on it.
But it's to make the effort to get it into you anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So Jimmy, we seen a report there from Michael as regards sterile brome from all around the country, and there's certain more reports of sterile brome. Is it more common now, or are we just reporting on it more now?
Yeah, it's probably always been brome. You'd see it in most ditches across. Even if you're going for a walk, you'd see brome in ditches. So I would say it's fairly. It's in most ditches, or it's in most places at this stage. I don't know if it's more prevalent, or I think maybe we're just becoming more used to it and more aware of it. So it's I think we're just potentially becoming a bit more aware of it being out there, and people are getting used to identifying it as well, which also helps.
It might have been a case maybe in terms of hedgerow management, maybe in the past might have been playing into the hands of weeds like that?
Absolutely. I suppose if you go back, and there probably is cases where we might have tilled right up to the bottom of a ditch, or where people might have sprayed off right up to the base of a hedge or whatever. And what they're doing is you're actually providing an environment for the brome to establish and to take over, I suppose, because it doesn't like that. It doesn't like that competition, so you're providing an environment where brome can proliferate, I suppose.
So the question Michael really had about brome, he was talking about it's very much in the margins there, and he's saying, well, what is the options that a farmer might have, both now if he has it and trying to get rid of it, say today or next week, but also in the future? How does he control that?
Yeah, so in the situation there, Michael was showing us, I suppose you can get in, you can strim, or you can go in with a hedge cutter and just trim at the base of the ditch or the base of the hedge there in order to prevent seed return at the moment. Coming into harvest time, you want to be really aware of where those patches of brome are, because if you're coming along and you have your combine right in at the ditch, you're going to pull in the brome into the field, and it's going to come out the back of the combine, and you have the problem in the field as well. So you just want to be very aware of where brome is and try and avoid cutting those patches and cutting around them. What we've found here in Oak Park is the arborgrass margins are a very effective way of preventing brome from encroaching in from the base of the ditches and the hedges. Anybody who was at the Oak Park Open Day here last year would have seen some very good demonstrations of how competitive Timothy and Coxfoot can be in outcompeting the brome. So it does come with a certain level of management, but I think that level of management is far outweighed by the level of control that you can get.
So does a guy then have to sacrifice a small part of his field in order to get that kind of control?
Yeah, like 2 meters would be, I think, is more than sufficient. We've seen plenty of people who are involved. We've seen a couple of farmers who are involved in the ECT project, and they have 2 meter margins around certain parts of the farm where they're finding brome encroaching, and it's doing a fabulous job of preventing that brome from getting into the field.
Okay, so just moving on a little bit from sterile brome, there's lots of other grass weeds out there, and there's wild oats and there's canary grass. Are they becoming more of a problem out there at the moment?
Yeah, look, they're definitely a problem. People don't seem to be as concerned about wild oats, maybe for whatever reason. I think we're just used to looking at them. But what we found in the last number of years, we've been doing a lot of testing. We found herbicide resistance testing, particularly around Wexford now, coming into a lot of populations of wild oats, which is very concerning. So they are, when you're starting to find resistance evolving, it becomes increasingly hard to control them. You also would be a little bit concerned about canary grass then, because what you're finding with canary grass is that you're finding it in, say, down in Wexford or maybe in East Cork, where you have a lot of continuous spring barley. You've only one herbicide option within those crops for controlling the wild oats and canary grass, which would be your Axial Pro. So in situations like that, the potential for herbicide resistance development can be quite high. So it is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to be managing adequately and appropriately.
Okay, and is there, on the resistance end of it, is that much of an issue, or is it widespread, I suppose? And maybe on the ECD project that we're running, have we found many instances of it around there?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say it's widespread. The herbicide resistance in the wild oats seems to be mostly confined to maybe the southeast region. Wexford particularly, we found cases in Kildea as well. But what we're finding is they're not just resistant to maybe Axial Pro, which is pinoxidin. They might be resistant to a number of the same family, which is the graminicides. So you might be looking at the likes of Falcon or the likes of Stratus Ultra, which would be the same family as Axial Pro. They're actually resistant across the board. So it's not just one active we're losing, it's a couple of different actives. So it's sort of important, that we are managing this situation, because it has the potential to cause a big problem when it comes to control. With canary grass, we haven't identified any resistance to date, but again, where you're only using one active to control something, the chances of resistance developing are high. So it's just something that we need to be aware of.
Okay, so you mentioned before the importance of weed identification. If a guy has a weed that he's going through, he's rogan at the moment, and he finds a grass weed and he doesn't know what it is, how does he go about trying to identify that?
Yeah, so if he wasn't comfortable trying to do it himself, like there's a lot of good aids out there, a lot of good publications out there, but if he wasn't confident trying to do it himself, contact his local Teagasc advisor or his local merchant. A lot of them would be quite good at identifying as well. But if you're really not sure, you can contact us in the ECT project here in Oak Park, and we'd be more than happy to help you out.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jimmy. So look, the floor is open for all sorts of questions. We have a number of them in here. I'm going to throw one, I suppose, straight away across to you, Jimmy. And it's one to do with perennial ryegrass in wheat that this farmer, Mervyn, reckons is resistance to Pacifica monolith, which is pretty much the same thing, I suppose. What are his control options? What are his integrated pest management options as well, cultural options?
So if he feels like the sulfonylureas maybe are he's looking like resistance, you can use, if you're going back in with a winter crop in the autumn, you can use the Phi in combination with the likes of Firebird, which potentially, and pendimethalin as well, which potentially should give you control. From a cultural point of view, you're looking at ryegrass is probably a bit of a different one, because it could germinate in either the autumn and the autumn and the spring. So trying to get a break crop into the rotation, whether it be oilseed rape or beans, you have your different range of actives within those crops as well. I would say to him, if he feels like it's resistant, get a sample of it and get it sent into us so we can get it tested and see what the resistance profile of it is, and just see, is it resistant, or was there something else going on at the time of spraying, or whatever that that might have caused an issue around the efficacy of the herbicide as well. Okay, all right. Just have a question here from Stephen. It's across to you, Shay, and just one about spring barley and the control of volunteer potatoes coming through.
Yeah, can be quite tricky. There's probably only two real alternatives there. One would be the likes of hurler. And unfortunately, years ago, we used to be able to use a higher rate than what we're allowed to use now in spring barley. We can only use 3/4 of a litre per hectare of star or hurler now, which was star in years ago. which used to crack the potatoes, but that was at 1.5 litre rate, so we don't really have that. But it will stunt the top growth, it won't take out the tuber. The other option we have then is something like Harmony Max, which will do a reasonably good job on them. And maybe in combination with both, you can get pretty good control. The big problem with potato control, volunteer control in cereals is that they tend to come from different depths. So even when you spray it the first time, you think you've killed them, you get a second flush of them come from deeper in the soil, you think the first application hasn't worked. But it's just the fact that those potatoes weren't above the ground when you sprayed the first time. So it can be quite tricky. So the likes of Hurler or Fluroxypar plus your Harmony Max is the way to go.
Okay, Jimmy, one kind of back to you. We have Vincent asking a question about rotations and blackgrass. If you have a good rotation, does that control blackgrass?
It'll definitely help, yeah, but it's not, rotation alone won't do the job. Again, it'll depend on the level of blackgrass in it. So rotation will be one of the key things you're looking at winter and spring cropping, whether it be winter and spring cereals, and then your break crops as well, which will always help. If it's not resistant, it'll help different range of actives as well. You're looking at, if you're going with winter crops involved, you need to push back your seeding rates, or you need to push back your sowing dates, because blackgrass will germinate from that sort of mid-August up to late September, early October. So you need to be going to from maybe the middle of October with your sowing dates, for instance. Using increased seeding rates, increased competition will help as well. There's some good research in the UK coming out about the use of hybrid barley, how it's very competitive, and it helps to reduce it as well. So rotation will be absolutely fundamental. I think it's probably the foundation of it, but you need to include all those other cultural controls on top of that, plus some herbicide usage as well, in order to get that 100% control. You know, rotation on its own probably isn't going to be effective. You need to bring in those additional measures on top of that.
Just to follow up on here again, coming from Jim here, he's talking about a zero tolerance approach to blackgrass. Is there, if a guy has blackgrass on his farm, should he just put it down to grass and you know, just take that danger away from the farm in total, or what should he do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that people should strongly consider. Like I say, once it gets up to a certain level, it can be very, very difficult to control. You're looking at crop destruct. So in a case where you're trying to maybe protect the rest of the farm and stop it spreading, taking out a certain field or a certain block and just putting it into grass for 5 years and managing that, stopping seed return, it's probably it's the safest way of doing it. But you know, so it depends on everybody's own situation. But in a lot of cases, when we go out and we see high infestations of it, putting it into grass is probably the best option.
Okay.
Can I make a point on that, Michael? And I agree with Jimmy about putting it into grass. And certainly it's one that we had a case this year where a farmer put it into grass. It's just another anecdote that we might look at as well. Putting it into grass isn't the solution on its own. We saw in that field where the farmer sowed it down to grass, where blackgrass, Jimmy mentioned about returning seed, blackgrass actually shot out in that grass field. So again, the guys have to be aware that putting it into grass isn't a solution on its own. They have to manage that grass to stop those blackgrass plants from heading out and producing more seed. So it's just something to be aware of. Putting it out to grass isn't a solution, a complete solution in itself.
Okay. Stephen, a very quick one for you from a question just coming up here. It's about winter wheat. Guys kind of looking out a little bit and looking at the T3. Does he need to put a T3 on or not?
So basically, I suppose that's going to be an air application to prevent fusarium primarily. And again, that's going to come down to the weather conditions at that time. If it was now, you'd be looking and saying the risk is very, very low. Look, at flowering, if it's going to be very wet, the risk is going to be considerably higher. And it's going to be about the amount of rain that is falling around that. And it's at that flowering. Mid-flowering is the timing that we're looking at for that. The other aspect, the one thing that I would say, that the weather conditions at the moment, if it does turn a bit of more moisture, brown rust could be an issue. And actually targeting, I suppose, what we would generally be targeting for fusarium, including azoles, would normally cover that brown rust aspect or potential for brown rust. So it's just one to be aware of, that if the disease risk for fusarium is very, very low, there is potential for brown rust potentially to come in. We would normally not see it because we normally put on a fusarium application.
So what does cheap and cheerful look like?
Cheap and cheerful. Okay, so from an aspect of the fusarium, again, it's going to be coming down to risk. If there's a high risk, it will be requiring something that covers most of the fusarium species. It's a complex number of fusariums and also microdochium. So therefore, we generally be looking at a mix of azoles or pathio-based with tebuconazole or metconazole, for example. They will cover the microdochium and the main, the main risks there from the different fusarium species. From brown rust, if it's just brown rust, potentially a strub could be included or just looked at, or even tebuconazole would cover that brown rust aspect also.
Okay. Okay, like we're closing in towards the end, lads. One last question, maybe to you, Shay, or maybe I'm not sure which lads would you want to take it. Stephen's asking a question about resistant chickweed. Can it be controlled at this stage in winter wheat with the flag leaf popping out?
Very difficult, I would say, at this stage with flag leaf coming out. Just thinking of the products that are available, you are very limited with those products. Just trying to think if the Pixar or the Zypar are available at that stage. I think they are, so that's probably your way to go. I just want to check the label. I need to check the label on those.
I think it'd be good to check the label in terms of the
might be a bit
latest.
late. Yeah, so it just depends on how, when say flag leaf, how late it is.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. We're going to leave it there. We're delighted that we got through an awful lot of the questions. We had a lot of people joining us this evening. There's the guts of 190 people joining us this evening. So we're delighted you stuck with us through the entire episode, if you like. My sincere thanks to Stephen, to Shay, and to Jimmy, but also to Michael McCarthy down in Cork, to John Pettit down in Wexford, and Conor O'Callaghan, and also the guys helping out in the video side of things. Shay did a huge amount of work on that, and we also had Kieran Collins and Martin Burke, and not to mention Declan here behind the scenes as well. So for this video, it will be up online tomorrow, so have a look at it on the Teagasc Crops YouTube channel. Go in there and have a look at it. If you missed a little bit and you want to kind of go back and see it again, go in there and have a look at it. For lots of other information that we're talking about this evening, you can go on to www.teagasc.ie. You're going to get lots of information there as well. Okay, look, that's it for this evening. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.